This program is presented by the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning at the University of San Francisco. The Fromm Institute, keeping up with the times no matter when.
I am ready. Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to, well, I was going to say it's good to see you. I almost can see you at the top of the screen. I don't know about you, but I find that in in most things in life, but certainly in terms of teaching and learning and classes, that there's a kind of rhythm that happens during the period of 8 weeks of a class coming together. You know, and those first couple of weeks are exploratory. We're trying to figure out who the professor is and what the subject is and who we are. And then as things begin to unfold, I think we all become just a little bit more comfortable with, if we were in the classroom, with one another, but certainly with the subject. I have been living in my head, at least for probably since June, when I really started in earnest to work on this class. Lenny Bernstein has been living in my brain, inside me for the longest time. And this week I found myself thinking a lot about how back in the 1960s, when I was a kid, living very close to New York City, realizing that what was going on at Avery Fisher Hall at that time was being conducted by Leonard Bernstein. I think I never got over to hear the New York Philharmonic at that period of my life, although I had been so exposed to Leonard Bernstein as a kid with my, the book that I really love, The Joy of Music. Um, but I've realized this week that he was really, he along with Robert Shaw as a conductor, but Leonard Bernstein as a teacher really has had a profound influence on my life. And one of the things that I am enjoying now, at the Fromm Institute, we say to our colleagues, teach to your curiosity is one of the things. And there's kind of there's a rubric which we say nobody repeats a class until 5 years have elapsed, which helps us as teachers as become learners, because we delve into subjects hopefully about which we're curious, about which we want to know more. And my goodness, is that true with Leonard Bernstein? So we are halfway, I cannot believe it, through our class. I have gotten some very warm and encouraging notes from a number of you telling stories, several of you who have experienced meeting Leonard Bernstein. I only met Leonard Bernstein quite almost by mistake, would have been in the early 70s. And I was living here because I was teaching at the conservatory. And I was in a rehearsal for a concert I was preparing, and I was at this rehearsal with Jimmy Schwabacher, whom some of you may remember. He was singing tenor, I was at the piano, we were working through his part, and it was in his home, in Jimmy's home, and all of a sudden, at this morning, it would have been 10 or 11 in the morning, sweeping down the stairs came a man in a white caftan, a cigarette in one hand and a cocktail in the other. We had a moment to say hello, and we went back to our French Baroque music that we were working on. But he has really grown on me as I've worked to prepare this course, and certainly as I'm teaching it and I'm thinking about him. That I think I kind of had adopted a lot of the critics' attitudes towards him when I was much younger, and that it was flamboyance for the sake of being flamboyant. He was bigger than life, but that's because he had to, for his own needs, he had to be bigger than life. And I kind of missed out at that point in my life on what a phenomenal musician he was, and what a phenomenal mind he had, and how, as an artist, how concerned he was about our society. I wonder where he would be now in his thinking. Several of you wrote that you had seen this new documentary. It's an hour and a half long called Bernstein's Wall. It was at the Mill Valley Film Festival last weekend. And one person wrote to me, Bernstein's Wall. In only 1.5 hours, the director tried to squeeze in much information. The focus was on Bernstein as a social activist and a philosopher's statement. Very different aspects of what we are covering in our class. It was very moving. It was an inspiring glimpse of that part of him and his life. Well, today we're going to begin to attach Lenny Bernstein to the time in which he was writing. It's so important. I've always said this particularly about, for example, Broadway musicals, that to understand a particular musical, and we're going to look at several today, it's really important to understand the milieu in which they take place, and what are the social pressures, and are there messages being given from the stage to the people of that particular generation. So going to see that other side of Lenny is also inspiring. And our last session, we're going to talk about him as a figure within a society, within a culture, certainly within the history of this country. So I've come away in my own study, my own growth, with a deeper appreciation of what a phenomenal presence he was in our cultural life, not just as a musician. And then the other thing I want to share with you as we begin today is a review by Mark Swed from the Los Angeles Times from a few days ago. The LA Philharmonic, which is one of the great orchestras of this country, with its great conductor Gustavo Dudamel, finally got back into Disney Hall after, almost 30, I don't remember how many months. But clearly they had been closed during the pandemic. The orchestra has been able to perform at the Hollywood Bowl. Obviously, there's lots of air there. But they finally got back into the hall last weekend, and Mark Swed wrote a review of it. And it was a kind of a very interesting potpourri of a program. And he wrote this. The soloist was Cynthia Erivo. Some of you may know her work. She came next on the program, he writes. Her performance of Somewhere from Bernstein's West Side Story at the Kennedy Center can be found on the National Symphony Orchestra's website. It is beautiful, says Mark Swed. Then he goes on. It is beautiful. With Dudamel and the LA Philharmonic, Erivo dropped the beautiful after about 30 seconds and dug deep, then brilliantly deeper. This somewhere she sought, with powerful, low, earthy tones and strikingly unearthly high ones, her timbre changing to meet the expressive needs of each word, while her intonation remained remarkably true. This was not out of reach, not outside of us at all, but she reached within. It was a spectacular performance. No one has any right to speak for Lenny Bernstein, but he was in the room somewhere. So we'll get to that song, obviously, at some point today, but that Bernstein lives and is being reimagined, reinterpreted as he was this past weekend with the opening of the LA Philharmonic. And to put that particular piece on the opening concert of a major symphony orchestra is pretty gutsy. Says a lot about where we are with classical music today. Okay, ready to go? A little preamble we've had here. I think you're all in the room by now. So give me just a second to share my screen. We'll go from there. So today, today our topic is Leonard Bernstein as a theater composer. And in the homework for this week, I sent you to a page in his in the website of the Leonard Bernstein website, which lists the shows and has small video clips for most of the shows. I still urge you, if you get a chance and are curious, to take a look at that. But look at these major 8 works, starting in 1944, when he and Jerome Robbins put together On the Town, coming all the way through to 1983 with an opera called A Quiet Place. We obviously can't spend time on every one of these pieces today, but I want us to look at some things that are familiar, and I want us also to look at some things which to most of us may be a bit unfamiliar. So our plan of our lesson plan for the day is as follows. We're going to start with 2 pieces that many of us are not acquainted with, two operas from 1951 and 1984, Trouble in Tahiti and A Quiet Place. And we're going to look at the relationship between these two, listen to a bit, look at a bit from them, and kind of grasp in a sense the trajectory of Lenny Bernstein's theater life and how he moved from something like Trouble in Tahiti to A Quiet Place. And in the between, he wrote a few other things. And we're going to look at in some depth a work called Mass from the early 70s. And finally, from the mid 1950s, we're going to take some time, hopefully, to explore West Side Story in a way that's novel, in a way that takes us beyond the things that we know, or takes us to the things that we know and helps us understand them more deeply. So we start with Trouble in Tahiti, an opera written in 1951, and A Quiet Place written in 1983, spanning basically his work, except for a couple of things in the 1940s, his work as a composer for the theater. Trouble in Tahiti opened in 1951. It's a 1-act opera, lasts approximately 50 minutes. The original A Quiet Place is a 1-act opera also, and it's a bit longer. It lasted around 110 minutes, received pretty bad reviews. What Washington Post said when it came out, to call the result a pretentious failure is putting it kindly. So these shows have gone back and forth. They've been revised. There is even a revision of A Quiet Place that is being held in secret by the Bernstein Trust or Archives, and has not really yet been released to people. But they created then, he and his collaborators created out of these 2 operas, one opera which is called A Quiet Place. This occurred after 1983, and the revised Quiet Place is an opera in 3 acts. Act 1 is from the part of the original A Quiet Place. Act 3 is from the original Quiet Place, and in the center they have placed most of the opera Trouble in Tahiti. So we end up with this longer opera. It premiered at La Scala, believe it or not, in 1984. And as I mentioned, he and his collaborators continued to revise it, and part of it is still not even available to us. So we come first of all to Trouble in Tahiti from 1951. It's the story. It actually has basically only 2 characters in the opera, and it's a picture of one day in the life of a desperately unhappy married couple who are lonely, who are longing for love, and yet they're unable to communicate with one another. And all of this, there's a kind of spiritual emptiness in their life. And this is all played, again, this now takes us to timing of the time when this appeared. It takes us, the contrast is between the emptiness of their relationship and the happy sort of consumerism of the 1950s. So this conflict is at the heart of the drama. Lenny dedicated this work to Mark Blitzstein, who had written several operas. We talked about him 2 or 3 weeks ago. And it was really Blitzstein who led him to the musical theater. So the whole show starts with an argument over breakfast, and they just explore this day in their life. Sam is a successful businessman, and Dinah is a frustrated housewife. It premiered on Broadway in 1955, and it was in a program called All in One, with a Tennessee Williams play and several dances, and it ran for all of 48 performances. A Quiet Place is a sequel to Trouble in Tahiti. It picks up on the unhappy family drama that was begun 30 years earlier, was commissioned and premiered by Houston Grand Opera in 1983. And then they did it as a double bill. They put the two operas sort of side by side. But then, as I mentioned, then it was all put together for later performances with Trouble in Tahiti sitting in the center as kind of flashbacks inside the contemporary opera. So, contemporary story, excuse me. So if we go to the opening of Trouble in Tahiti, remember we're only dealing with one day, we're at breakfast with these guys, and what kind of a picture does Leonard Bernstein does he draw with this text? Morning sun kisses the windows, the walls of the little white house, kisses the doorknobs, kisses the roof, kisses the doorknob and the pretty red roof of the little white house in Scarsdale. So here is Lenny already at the very opening of the show, beginning to make social commentary, not only with a text like this and the life of the small life of these people, but the popular musical idiom of their day.
Morning sun, kisses the windows, kisses the walls, kisses the windows, kisses the walls of the little white house, kisses the doorknob, kisses the roof, kisses the doorknob, the pretty red roof of the little white house in Scarsdale. Friendly sun opens the eyelids, opens the eyes, opens the eyelids, opens the eyes of the husband and wife. Kindles their faces, kindles their love, kindles their faces with greetings of love in the little white house in Wellesley. Suburbia, out in the spots, out of the hubbub, less than an hour by train. Suburbia, sweet in the spring, helpful in winter, saves us a bother of summers in May. Morning sun, kiss the driveway, kiss the lawn, kiss the flagstones on the front lawn of the little white house, kiss the paper at the front door, kiss the roses around the front door of the little white house in Ozone.
So very subtly with this text, he draws a picture for us of this family, and he draws it in the midst of all the comfortable music of the 1950s. Well, what has happened to this couple 30 years hence as we move to A Quiet Place, same couple, and how does Lenny start the opera that is going to tell the story of where this couple has gone in the last 30 years? And rather than starting with that kind of jazzy introduction of like the Four Freshmen that were so popular in the 50s, he instead creates, and he called that first piece that we just listened to a prelude. Well, we have a prelude in A Quiet Place, which is a very different scene. We are drawn into the reality of Dinah's and Sam's existence with only an orchestral introduction. Well, I don't think we're in four freshman land anymore. Actually, in the story, we're gonna hear a little bit more in a moment. But in the story, Dinah has died. The scene opens up at the funeral parlor, where the family, which is riven with all sorts of dynamics of trouble, has come together. And here we realize instantly that we have been transported 30 years. The musical language has changed. Let's listen to a couple of other quick things from each of the operas. We'll go back now for a moment to Trouble in Tahiti. And in one of the scenes, Dinah is in a hat shop and trying on clothes. And she tells someone else who's in the room, probably a clerk, she tells about a sea romance novel movie called Trouble in Tahiti, which she has just spent the afternoon watching at the movie theater. And at first she dismisses the movie as just technicolor drivel. But as she recounts the story in its theme song, which is called Island Magic, she gets caught up again in a kind of an escapist fantasy of what love is. Here is Dinah's little of her aria in the clothing shop.
What a movie! What a terrible, awful movie! It's a crime what they put on the screen. I can hardly believe what I've seen. Do they think we're a lot of children? It would bore any 4-year-old. What drivel! What nonsense! What escapist technicolor twaddle! Trouble in Tahiti, indeed. Trouble in Tahiti, imagine. There she is, in her inch or two of sarong, floating, floating, all among the floating flowers. Then she sees him, the handsome American. I must say he's really a man, 6 feet tall and each foot just incredible. Well, they're madly in love, but there's trouble ahead. There's a legend. If a princess marry white man and rape all that day, then the white man shall be sacrificed without delay. Sure enough, on the night of their wedding day, there's a storm like nothing on earth. Tidal waves and siroccos and hurricanes. And to top it all off, the volcano erupts as the natives sing,
Well, he certainly sets the scene. And it's in terms of the way he sets it musically, and yet he's making commentary on life in a married household in the early 1950s. Some of us can think back to that. We now move ahead 30 years to their story again, and Dinah is no longer alive, and we're going to hear Sam's aria. And Sam is her widowed husband. He really is isolated. He's all alone, and everyone in the room each person is sort of absorbed in his or her own thoughts, and we hear little fragments of the conversation. They discuss the fact that Dinah died in a car accident. They're mourning, and they're also sort of revealing in this scene what has happened in the ensuing 30 years. There is no video of this, which is in a way kind of nice because it draws us just to listen to the sound. And if we were in the classroom, I would ask you all to choose another composer from 1983, 4, 5, whom he might have been listening to, but listen to how his style has changed in terms of the aria that is sung by Sam.
You're late, you shouldn't have come. The saddest things are running through my mind. You should be ashamed. But are you? You should all be ashamed. Don't never call it loving. I chose that line. I used to think, you know, that life was terrific, that I would always win, that I could talk to anyone. Beautiful baby girl, but you, I can't talk to you. Your mother couldn't talk to you. Your mother couldn't talk to me. Oh, never told it enough. None of us can talk to anyone. Not even now. Love me. Look at me. The winner. When did I stop winning? Want to know when I was saddled with you. My hand some.
This is a very sophisticated writing, and it's like his available palette as a composer has expanded so much in these 30 years. Now, I grant you that the scene that he's portraying in Trouble in Tahiti is a 1950s scene, and here we're dealing with a 1980s scene, but that he has stretched his abilities to express feelings. To me, as I hear this, I hear a lot of the music, interestingly enough, of Benjamin Britten. I know he's a hero of mine, but Lenny Bernstein's becoming one. But there is a freedom with text here and an importance of text that he could very well have learned from, among other people, from Benjamin Britten. So I open today, taking the first 20 minutes of our time, my guess is that if we were to raise hands in our room, how many hands would go up when I said, how many of you know these two works? Probably very few of us do. Certainly has been true for me. I've known the pieces are there, but I really have had very little exposure to them. And I think it also provides us with a kind of a graphic oral representation of him in 1951 and the Leonard Bernstein of 1983. But now I want to move on and look much more in depth at two pieces this afternoon. The first one is Mass. The second one is West Side Story. And as someone was mentioning from watching this new film about sort of placing Leonard Bernstein in a cultural, a social context is a major part of this new film. I think as we get ready to listen to Leonard Bernstein's Mass, which he calls, as you see, a theater piece for singers, players, and dancers. This is not something for a Roman Catholic cathedral. I think it's important to look at that date, 1971, and realize that this piece grew out of the 1960s. Almost all of us were alive in the 1960s. Let's just take a moment to refresh our memories.
How many roads must a man walk down before you call him a man? How many seas must the white dove sail before she sleeps in the sand? Yes, and how many times must the cannonballs fly before they're forever banned? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. Yes, and how many years can a mountain exist before it is washed to the sea? Yes, and how many years can some people exist before they're allowed to be free? Yes, and how many times can a man turn his head and pretend that he just doesn't see? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind.
I'm sure most of us can relate to many of those images. To bring back, and it's also important, I think, to bring this back into our consciousness, particularly now in the year 2021, to remember where we were as a culture throughout the 1960s, the intolerance, the anger, the anti-war sentiments, the assassinations, the riots that took place, and the nation being torn asunder. And so for the opening of the Kennedy Center in the early 1970s, Leonard Bernstein wrote what he calls Mass. Here's a trailer for that show.
Glory to God in the highest, and peace on earth to men of goodwill.
Bernstein's not intimidated by anything. That's not part of his vocabulary, intimidation.
He tried to take all the elements of his life, his love for pop and rock music, his love for theater and dance and motion. It was an extraordinary attempt to create another art form.
Sing God a simple song, louder, day. Make it up as you go along, louder,
In my mind, Mass is one of the most important, if not the most important score he wrote, because for the first time it brought together these halves of his musical personality and his persona. You might call them the sacred, the secular, the Hebrew music, and the New York music. For the first time, all of these came together as a one.
If you ask me to love you on a bed of spice, well, that might be nice once or twice.
I believe in one God, but then I believe in three. I believe in 20 gods, they'll believe in me. That's a pact, shake on that, no taking back.
God said, let there be light, and there was light.
Said, let there be night, and there was
God said, let there be day, and there was day.
to follow the night.
And it was good, brother.
And it was good, brother.
And it was good, brother.
And it was goddamn good.
I think it's how to maintain faith honest at a time when it's so hard to have any faith at all.
I confess to Almighty God, to Blessed Mary, ever Virgin, to Blessed Michael the Archangel, to Blessed John the Baptist, to the holy apostles Peter and Paul.
It's really interesting when we look back at the history of theater music. This piece doesn't get mentioned, frequently doesn't get mentioned, and yet from the night coming from straight out of the 1960s, all you have to do is to remember Godspell or Jesus Christ Superstar. Fascinating article in today's New York Times about the recording that was made of Jesus Christ Superstar, which preceded any stage production whatsoever. So what if we look at a kind of a lineage of religious pieces or pieces based on religious stories, this fits right in. Well, it opened the Kennedy Center in 1971, but of course we had to have critics were at his throat almost immediately. On the 9th of September 1971, the day after, Harold Schoenberg wrote the piece. He dismissed it as, quote, fashionable kitsch, cheap, and vulgar. Now that's the New York Times on September 9th, 1971. That same morning, Paul Hume, who was the chief music critic of the Washington Post, hailed the piece as a, quote, rich amalgamation of the theater arts, quote, end quote, and, quote, the greatest music Bernstein has ever written. Now compare those two reviews between Hume and Harold Schoenberg. There have been several revivals of the piece. It's interesting to listen to Mark Swed, who actually wrote the review I read you this morning about the opening of the LA Philharmonic. The LA Phil did the piece, I think, in 2018. And here is what he says in the LA Times, quote, I think that if it's not his worst, it surely reflects his worst tendencies. His allergy to self-editing, his saccharine streak, his embarrassing wordplay, his obsession with and tone deafness toward youth culture, his weak counterfeits of pop styles, bloated, bombastic, cloying, quaint, and smug. I just love all these words critics can come up with. And occasionally, it must be said, very pretty. Mass now exists mainly as a stale memento of the aftermath of the liberalization in Catholic ritual inspired by the Second Vatican Council. I don't get that at all. A strained union of high and low culture. It was Bernstein's grand effort to match the counterculture fueled energy of recent hits like Jesus Christ Superstar. We've had similar reviews from people like Zachary Wolfe in the New York Times. Well, speaking of the Times, there were political implications to this. By the time Lenny wrote Mass, he had been under investigation by the United States government for 20 years. There was an 800-page FBI file that documented his leftist activities, his beliefs, his anti-war beliefs, his beliefs about the inequality of our society and about racism. And in the summer of 1971, the FBI went to the White House and reported to them that there had been a meeting between Leonard Bernstein and Daniel Berrigan, the left-wing Jesuit priest who had been imprisoned for destroying draft files. And for Bernstein, this meeting was really part of his research for writing Mass. But the FBI believed he was plotting to insert subversive anti-war messages into the Latin texts, and he advised Nixon to stay home and not go to the premiere. Well, we have been through a kind of desert, a drought in terms of the music of the Mass until the last probably 5 years, when this piece has been, in a sense, rediscovered, and some of its power and beauty have risen to the surface. And one of the persons who who has been so instrumental in bringing this piece to our attention is Maren Alsop, who is just retiring as the conductor of the Baltimore Symphony, but also is the, there's a word for what, she's the kind of the artistic curator and conductor at the Ravinia Festival, which is Chicago Symphony's summer home. She has been a real proponent in digging deeper into this work.
This piece, The Mass by Leonard Bernstein, is one of the most avant-garde. It's a piece filled with risk. It's a piece that challenges us. It's a piece that comes at us with arms wide open and also says, I'm going to make you think about the world you live in.
We have a special responsibility to the arts, for art is the great democrat, calling forth creative genius from every sector of society, disregarding race or religion or wealth or color.
When Bernstein was asked by JFK's widow, Jackie Kennedy Onassis, to write a piece for the opening of the Kennedy Center, he thought, okay, what is singular to JFK? And the fact that Kennedy was the only Roman Catholic president came up into his mind. And he said, okay, I'm going to use the Mass, really the iconic representation of Catholicism, to hang all of these ideas on and use it as a structure, a framework, and a journey. So it's not really a Mass per se, but he uses all the sections of the Mass, all the sort of implications of the offertory, the communion, the confession, uses all those in a way to tell his story.
My father had always, of course, been a champion of social justice, of peace. He put all of that into Mass. Also, he was a man of faith. He was very spiritual.
It's about something complicated. It's about a crisis of faith, my father's crisis of faith, but also America's crisis of faith. And it was, the early 1970s, we were still very much in the turbulence of the 1960s. And this is what the piece was born out of.
It was such a critical moment in the history of the United States, particularly because of the situation in Vietnam, because of the transition to civil rights and that whole movement. It was a hot moment in our history. Mass, I think, is the ultimate moralistic story for Bernstein. This is the story about tolerance, about questioning, about belief, about love, about unity, about brotherhood, about humankind. I think it's one of the most beautiful stories ever told. And it feels more relevant today than in 1971 when it was premiered, and people really didn't know what to make of it.
So there's a part in Mass where they read from letters. It's a normal part of the Catholic liturgy, and Kevin Newbury, the director, came up with this fantastic idea in which he invited members of the street chorus to contribute their own letters that speak to issues that we feel passionate about today or that make us feel in some way imprisoned. And so that lends this production an extra quality of immediacy that I think is very powerful.
I think when she says letters are a part of the Roman Catholic Mass, actually letters as letters are not, but certainly what grew out of prayers of petition, asking God for X, Y, and Z, or bringing up issues to remind us all to be aware of what's going on in our world. That is an integral part of the Mass, and then the director takes that part of the Mass and turns it into what you're going to experience in a few minutes, the reading of letters that they're moments of concern, I guess, is the way to say it. But here is Maren Alsop, I think, taking us more deeply into this work in a way that really certainly has helped me understand. It's a piece I've kind of shied away from because of all those bad reviews that I read many years ago. And it continues, as you can see, it continues by people like Zachary Wolf or Mark Swed. It continues to be panned as too much, that it was like he was throwing everything musical at the wall that he possibly could, and they all stuck, and so he has to use them all in this piece of music. But there was a side to Lenny. He had well, humility is not the word, but he realized he needed to move beyond just himself. So he turned to a number of people to help him. Stephen Schwartz, who wrote, for example, Wicked, among other things. He engaged him to write lyrics for some of the songs, and he wrote a song called "I Go On," which is a response to the Lord's Prayer. And the words that Stephen Schwartz wrote were, "When my courage crumbles, when I feel confused and frail, when my spirit falters on decaying altars and my illusions fail, I go on." There, in a sense, is the kernel of the piece, and that text should follow a prayer to God, the Our Father. When my courage crumbles, when I'm confused and frail, when my spirit falters and my illusions fail. So Schwartz in that moment captures it. Another obviously very popular songwriter, who was a young guy at that time, was Paul Simon. And he provided some text to sort of challenge the tenets of faith that get expressed in the Christian creed. And he writes these words: "Half the people are stoned, and the other half are waiting for the next election. Half the people are drowned, and the other half are swimming in the wrong direction." An interesting commentary on the late 1960s. Here's Stephen Schwartz talking about the piece, a little bit about what it was like to work with Lenny.
I loved the settings of the Latin texts. I thought they were just beautiful and exciting and did all those things that were special to Lenny as a composer. The real gift for melody and harmony, but the shifting rhythms that just seemed completely natural and completely to come out of the text themselves. And yet, if you looked at them on the page, were like a different time signature every bar, but to the ear, they don't land like that. And I really loved those. And that existed from the beginning. If I had any sort of reservations about music per se, it was the sort of pop areas, because we were in 1971 and Lenny's point of view about pop was kind of late 50s, early 60s. So it didn't sound to me right of the time. What's interesting now is because, 1971 is also sort of dated, but sort of not. All the pop sections now to me sound...
I'm very sorry. I pushed the wrong button, everybody. Let me see if I can speed this up.
And, I don't have any sort of response to how contemporary they are or not. In fact, of course, what's happened to the piece, and it's why I think the piece has so stood the test of time and in some ways seems stronger now than it did then, is that at that time, Lenny, when he wrote a big classical piece, particularly like this, was using a bunch of different styles. So to many critics of the time, it sounded like a hodgepodge. It sounded like neither this nor there. It was like everything but the kitchen sink. Some people said, now, of course, all classical music is like that. All classical music is this compendium of styles and jazz and pop and 12-tone and classical, classical, all mushed together in different ways. And this is where classical music has come. But Lenny was ahead of that. And he was particularly ahead of that in Mass. So I think that to some, classically critical ears of the time, it just didn't make sense to them. Now it makes a lot more sense. Mass was first done in 1971. If you had asked me to bet on how well is this going to age, I would have said, oh, it's so much Vietnam War and kind of protest and just of the period. I don't think this is going to be one of the pieces of Lenny's that really will, live on and on. But I was wrong. It really has aged enormously and, to me, surprisingly well. And it has to do with the fact that musically, how he was thinking about classical music, or whatever you want to call it, was ahead of its time, and now time has caught up.
That is, the last sentence is so important in light of this piece. That he was ahead for whatever sets of reasons. He was really ahead of his time. And it is true that, it's interesting. When you talk to college students, younger people today, and you talk about music with them, it's tabula rasa. They do not have in their minds, this is classical music, this is popular music, or this is world music, or this is mood music. For them, it's all music. That's why I like the plural. There are many musics in our culture today. And here was Lenny, he didn't know, in a sense, what he was doing. He was already there, seeing musics together, and that they can all contribute to a piece. And now, and part of it has to do with the fact that everybody has one of these in their pocket, and for many, many people, this is the song, the song chart of their lives, if you will. Oh, today I want to hear a little of this, or I want to hear a little of that. They don't think of Baroque music or classical music or romantic music. It's all music. And here is Lenny, in this piece particularly, getting ahead of his time. So how can I, in about the last 5 minutes of our first half today, how can I who have looked at it and listened to it. By the way, if you have PBS Passport, there is a phenomenal recording of this from the Ravinia Center with the Chicago Symphony, with Marin Alsop conducting, that is available on PBS. And actually that, except for one of the clips, those are the clips that I'm showing you. So I thought, how in a few minutes can I share with you the story, the different musical styles, and the drama, how he attains the power of the drama. So I thought I'll create a little video, which I did. But before we watch the video, let me tell you what is in the video. So the very center of the production is the celebrant, or the priest. He, and it is a he in this case, he stands at the center, and he is in the midst of his own crisis of faith. He's asking himself, how can I stand here, pray for, preach about peace when the world is falling apart, when religion doesn't really have much of an answer? And so we find ourselves, interestingly, just like Lenny in his own way was torn between different polarities of his life, we find these poles here. So there is a religious establishment of which the priest or the celebrant is a part. And in that, there is a big chorus, there is a children's chorus, and there's a full symphony orchestra, so that they stand on that left side of the stage as the establishment of religion. On the other hand, and almost in opposition to religion, is the real world. Now this is what Mass is trying to talk about. Here is the real world, and over here we have a marching band, we have a jazz combo playing, and we even have a street chorus made up of ostensibly of people from a society who have nothing to do with religion. And this entire conflict is set up and is expressed through the priest. So you're going to see a lot of these different parts in the video collage that I want to share with you. In the first part, you're going to hear the priest singing what is called a simple song. Sing God a simple song, Lauda Laude. It's probably the most well-known and famous piece to be still that we still recognize. And then all of a sudden, in all of this gentle, simple song, the world intervenes. And we'll see how the world comes in and breaks down the walls of religion, breaks down the walls of race, breaks down the walls that poverty builds, and intervenes inside the Mass and absolutely stirs it up, and also speaks to this celebrant. And he is coming towards the end of the Latin text, and he gets to Dona nobis pacem, grant us peace. And he asks himself, what peace? How can there possibly be peace? And he is totally disillusioned with the fact that religion seems to have no answers to the cultural crisis that we find ourselves in. But he ends it with hope and with a prayer at the very end, where the chorus sings, Almighty Father, incline your ear, bless us and all those who have gathered here. Your angels send us, who shall defend us, and fill us with grace. Fill all of us who dwell in this place. Amen. And then the priest, as always happens in the Mass, says the Mass is ended. Go out into the world. So here is this video that I hope can give you at least the tiniest of tastes of this piece and send you riding out to PBS to see the whole thing. This is Paolo Schott.
Sing the Lord a new song, to praise him, to bless the Lord. I will sing his praises while I live, all of my days. Blessed is the man who loves the Lord. Blessed is the man who praises him. Louder, 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 and walks in his way.
Dearly beloved, we have people in power who are using hate, fear, and lies to separate us from each other and from the ideals for which our country has come to stand. As a person in a position of privilege and opportunity, I now realize that we have the power, and more importantly, the responsibility to act as both a sword and a shield for those persons facing oppression from their own government.
The Mass is ended.
So I commend to you a piece that maybe many of you didn't know about. Take some time in the next week or two to look into this and to maybe experience it. But when you come back after our 4.5 minutes of break, we're going to go to something very familiar, but hopefully we're going to take a little bit of a different view of it all. So we'll be away for 4.5 minutes, and I'll see you then. Bye-bye. Let me share my screen, and we will continue. Welcome back, everybody. So as we now move back in time to the mid-50s, having just been up at 1971, but really letting it was the 60s that informed that, I think it's important to take just a moment. David Halberstam, for example, wrote a fabulous book about the 50s, which I recommend highly, and he talks about how quiet the culture was then. But let's just take a little view of it, okay? The 50s really were captured in black and white, but color TV was just around the corner.
Hey, donny, ding dong, a-ling, boom, ba-do, 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 ba-ba. Oh, life could be a dream if I could take you up in paradise up above. If you would tell me I'm the only one that you love, life could be a dream, sweetheart. Hello, hello again, shaboom, and up we'll meet again. Oh, life could be a dream. If only all my precious plans would come true. If you would let me spend my whole life loving you, life could be a dream, sweetheart. Now every time I look at you, something is on my mind. If you do what I want you to, baby, we'd be so fine. Oh, life could be a dream if I could take you up in paradise up above. If you would tell me I'm the only one that you love, life could be a dream, sweetheart.
You know, I'd forgotten that I had put this in, and so while it was playing, I reached into my desk. I still have my I Like Ike button from I guess it would be 1951. I remember in the middle of Indiana, Richard Nixon came to town as the vice presidential nominee, and I, little junior Republican that I was at that point in my life, I had to have my own I Like Ike button. Maybe I could make a lot of money for that on eBay. I don't know. Anyway, 1950s, and if we look back at the 1950s, many people call it the golden age of the musical on Broadway. Look at these shows. The numbers at the very right side are the number of performances which they had. And you'll notice where West Side Story ends up, way down towards the bottom of the 15 most performed shows from the 1950s, with only a little over 700 performances, as opposed to, for example, My Fair Lady, over 2,700 of them. Here was the trailer for the recent Broadway revival. Don't forget that Steven Spielberg is creating a new movie about West Side Story. I looked at the trailer. I was going to play it. It's so sort of far out. Take a look at it. I'm going to go see the movie. It's going to be an interesting 2020 take on this musical from the 1950s. But here was that trailer for the Broadway production of late.
Mambo, mambo, go!
Takes you back, doesn't it? The creation of this show was in many respects a kind of a perfect storm where four people came together, and we'll talk about how that happened. Arthur Lawrence, Jerry Robbins, Stephen Sondheim, and obviously our guy Leonard Bernstein. Now, Arthur Lawrence, you know him from his writing the books for musicals like La Cage aux Folles, Anyone Can Whistle, West Side Story, obviously. He wrote for film, and he also wrote for the stage. And one of his most important and earliest pieces of writing the book for was I Can Get It For You Wholesale, and obviously Gypsy. So one of the collaborators. The second collaborator, he was only 25 years old when he was introduced to Lenny Bernstein, who had heard one of his, it was actually Sondheim's sort of first musical called Saturday Night, and he quickly hired him to write the lyrics for this. And I wanted to share with you just a couple of things today. This is a marvelous book. It's one of 2 volumes of Stephen Sondheim. It's all of his lyrics. And he talks about when he first met Leonard Bernstein. And he talks about this way. I arrived at the vast Bernstein apartment with my portfolio and was ushered into Lenny's small, dark studio. He liked to work with as little visual distraction as possible, so he chose to use not only the smallest of their 14 rooms, but also the one that looked out on an air shaft. I played him a few songs from Saturday Night. He listened, and then he asked me, "Have you got something more poetic?" I did indeed, but I told him no. I had only conversational lyrics to offer. I had no intention of bringing my early overwrite attempts to light for him. Lyrics from my apprentice shows when I was imitating Oscar Hammerstein and his penchant for natural imagery in his writing. Wonderful set of books if you're ever interested in Steve Sondheim's work. Well, here's Steve talking about well, you'll see it's talking about the recording, but it's talking about his relationship with Bernstein. And he refers to Goddard Lieberson a lot, who was the head of Columbia Records at that time. So this is his take on the recording sessions.
I met Goddard Lieberson when we were working on West Side Story because he was a great friend of the Bernsteins and he would show up at parties and things like that. But the first professional meeting was when we played him the score of West Side. Lenny and I, and we were playing for Goddard, but there was also the producer. Well, the producer, one of the producers, Roger Stevens, was abroad, but he had an assistant, a lady named Sylvia Drewley, and she sort of represented him. And the original lyric of Geoff Krupke ended with Geoff Krupke, you, because I wanted to be the first person to use a four-letter word in a musical. But of course, looked over and Sylvia Drewley's face had turned the color of a sheet, and which I thought was perfectly fine. I thought, shock people, that's great. But Goddard came over to me at the end and he said, I think you're going to have to change that. I said, oh, come on, you really going to worry about shocking people? He said, no. It's just that if you use that, the record cannot be shipped over the state line and can only be sold in New York State. Oh, so changed it to Krupp U. On West Side, I ran into another word problem because nobody had told me that schmuck also was a word that could not be shipped over the state line. So I had to change the quatrain while I was in the studio, again, at Goddard's request. Goddard's recording sessions were very jolly because he had a sharp, funny sense of humor, very sarcastic. But, no, people laughed and he was a gent. No, I think everybody liked working. I was responsible during the West Side Story session for I represented Lenny because he was abroad with the Philharmonic in Israel, and so and I was a kid and I was terrified, but Goddard made me feel very confident, and I was able to make suggestions about tempos and things like that. Goddard's theory, as you probably know, was that since the listener had nothing visual to distract him, it was all listening. Virtually every song was played maybe up to a quarter faster than it was on the stage, certainly all the dance music. And I warned Lenny, I wrote him a letter, and I said, you're going to be shocked at some of the tempos, but I did approve them because Goddard is very convincing about there being faster on the recording than they are on the stage. And Lenny was upset. Upset may be too big a word. Distressed.
So here we have the lyricist in his late 20s running an entire recording session, basically, as Leonard Bernstein's representative. But what to me is even more fascinating is how Sondheim and Bernstein worked together to get the lyrics. And Bernstein had written a few lyrics for the show when he hired Steve Sondheim to really complete them and to create them. But he, of course, had his favorite passages, and one of them that I enjoy that Sondheim talks about is the song I Have a Love. We'll listen to a little bit in a moment. But in Bernstein's, this is how Bernstein wanted to set it. Once in your life, only once in your life comes a flash of fire and light, and there stands your love, the harvest of your years. Steve Sondheim did not want to use that, so he turns it into I have a love, and it's all that I have, right or wrong. What else can I do? I love him. I'm his, and everything he is. I like the Sondheim lyric a lot better. I hope you do too. But it's interesting to see how these kind of subtle differences between the two of them and how they were able to work together. And as many of you are aware, originally Sondheim was not given the the full credit he should have been as the lyricist, and Bernstein readily agreed to it, and I think it also involved a little bit of money. It's interesting to look at other stories. For example, I Feel Pretty. He is so, well, he tells this wonderful story. This is in a very interesting book about Stephen Sondheim by Meryl Seacrest, who also wrote a fascinating book about Lenny Bernstein. But here's Steve Sondheim writing. And one of the most embarrassing moments of my life was after a run-through of West Side Story when some of my friends were out front. I asked Sheldon Harnick, lyricist for Fiddler on the Roof, for example. I asked Sheldon after the show what he thought of it, knowing full well that he was going to fall on his knees and lick the sidewalk. Instead, he said, "There's that lyric, I feel pretty." Steve says, well, I thought the lyric was terrific. I had spent the previous 2 years of my life rhyming day and way and me and be, and with I feel pretty, I wanted to show that I could do inner rhymes. That's why I had this uneducated Puerto Rican girl singing, "It's alarming how charming I feel." You must know she would not have been unwelcome in Noel Coward's living room. He says, Sheldon Harnick was very gentle. I immediately went back and wrote a simplified version of the lyric, which no one liked. And so to this, he says, and so to this day, it embarrasses me every time it's sung because that particular movement is full of mistakes just like that. Jerry Robbins was the third of the four people to put this together, born in 1918, died in 1998. He was a producer, he was a theater producer, a director, and a choreographer. And he sometimes directed films, sometimes he worked in television, but mostly he worked like in things from all the way from classical ballet to contemporary musical theater. He choreographed and helped produce The King and I, Pajama Game, Bells Are Ringing, Gypsy, Fiddler on the Roof, and he won a Tony Award 5 times. And it's interesting to think of the learning process that this young Steve Sondheim had to go through when he encountered not only Leonard Bernstein, but when he encountered Jerry Robbins, who was not the easiest person to deal with. And so we have this wonderful scene that they were setting up where Tony has met Maria, and the most beautiful sound he's ever heard is the single word Maria, Maria, Maria. And they're getting ready to create this scene, to create the lyrics, create how the scene is going to go. And again, Steve talks about it. He says, I learned an invaluable lesson from Robbins early on during the rehearsal of Maria. Robbins wanted to know what the hero, Tony, was doing. And I said, well, he's standing outside her house and, he senses that she's going to appear on the balcony. Robbins said, yeah, but what is he doing? Sondheim says, oh, he's standing there and singing a song. Robbins getting testy. What is he doing? Sondheim, well, he sings Maria, Maria. I just met a girl named Maria, and suddenly the name will never be the same to me. And Robbins says, and then what happens? Sondheim says, then he sings. Robbins, you mean he just stands there looking at the audience? Sondheim, well, yes. Robbins walks off and says, you stage it.
Maria.
Larry Kerr.
The most beautiful sound I ever heard. All the beautiful sounds of the world in a single word. Just met a girl.
We know where that's going. Here he's talking about, they're talking about the choreography of
the Jets and the Sharks were not allowed to fraternize during rehearsal or eat lunch together, and Lee Becker, the actress playing Anybody's, was shunned by both groups. In The Dance at the Gym, Robbins strived for realism in creating a dance-off between the Jets and the Sharks in a way that didn't seem too choreographed. Robbins worked with the Jets and Gennaro worked with the Sharks, so when they rehearsed the number together for the first time, neither group knew what the other was doing or had heard the music in its entirety. The number actually developed into a real dance competition between both groups.
Chita Rivera was obviously one of the original cast members in the show, and she talked about what it was like to be in the rehearsal room with Steve Sondheim, with Leonard Bernstein, and with the other two, to how powerful it was to be in that room, but also how powerful it was to be creating this musical in the early 1950s, when things were beginning to change socially in the country.
When you take me back, it's still so thrilling and still so moving. That experience to see Jerome Robbins, Stephen Sondheim, Arthur Lawrence, and Leonard Bernstein in the same room, and seeing it come right out of their mouths, right from their fingertips, to be there. And I remember moments all, so clearly of when the cha-cha came out the first time, and we saw it. Nobody else had seen it but us, and I saw it come out of Jerry, and it was just great. So we have these great memories, and it was at a time where we had our serious gang problems. I mean, it was during that time that there was a young man that was killed in the playground just down the block from our rehearsal hall. And we came in one day, and on the signing board where we sign in, this was this huge front page picture of this young man standing over this body with a knife in his hand. And above it, it said, "This is your life." And Jerry.
This is your life, and that's what West Side Story is trying to show people. It opened 1957. It got one Tony Award for choreography. It ran for 732 performances, but it was the film that really put it on the map. So a little quiz. What show do you think won the Tony as the best new musical in the year 1957, since it was not West Side Story? Well, it was The Music Man. And I love to refer to these two musicals. It seems to me West Side Story is looking to the future. And this is where we're headed. This is your life. Whereas I call The Music Man, which is a phenomenal show, I call it the Norman Rockwell musical, because it takes place in 1911 or 12 in the middle of the country, total opposite of West Side Story. But there they were, 1957, both nominated for Best Musical of the Year. Well, how do we approach it? I think we first of all take a moment just to look at the story, but then to look at the music. It went through many, many years of ideas. It started out as an East Side story with a Jewish boy and a Catholic girl taking place in Los Angeles. They also wanted to do one in Los Angeles between Latino gangs. And there was a time where they were going to set it as a modern version, obviously, of Romeo and Juliet, but they were going to set it at the point in time where Easter and Passover celebrations come exactly the same time, which happens every so many years. And feelings run high between Jews and Catholics. Juliet is the Jewish one. And there are street brawls and double death and everything together. So Lenny writes, if it's all much less important than the bigger idea of making a musical that tells a tragic story in musical comedy terms, using musical comedy techniques and never falling into the operatic trap. And Lenny asks, can it succeed? He says, it hasn't yet in our country. I'm excited. If it can work, it's the first time. Fascinating we're going to have a stab at it. Here he describes it.
Way back in 1949, Jerome Robbins, with whom I'd worked, called me up with a terrific idea. He was wildly excited. A Broadway show based on Romeo and Juliet. I thought this was a very exciting idea. He had a notion that it should be based on street warfare in the New York slums.
Go back and do that once more. Still, all three of you.
That can't be for you.
Every part boardwalk.
Thank you. What are you?
Hi, how are you?
Which one's Consuelo?
Hi, me.
Okay. All right. Where are you? Jerome Robbins brought me and Arthur Lawrence together. We all shook hands on it. Arthur Lawrence making one proviso. This is not going to be an opera, he said.
Now, have you know, I know this piece very well. I didn't used to till this week. But because I've never conducted it in my life, and I've never studied the score till now, I had to study it every day, every night for the last 10 days. I think it's so funky. I can't get over how funky this piece is. When my kids talk about, oh, this or that on the radio. See, that's what's new. That's what's in. That's funky. That's really R&B. It's acid rock. It's hard. It's soft. It's all in here. This one, I'm so proud of it. Oh.
So let's now look at the characters. As we have Shakespeare brought up to the year 1957, and to the Capulet, etc., we have the Jets and the Sharks. The Jets with Riff and Tony, the Sharks with Bernardo and Maria. And obviously the relationship happens between the two groups of people, and that's really not allowed. And then we do have a few adults in the cast who are also based on the Shakespearean characters. It's important to stop and look at what, as we step back from the musical, to look at some of the social themes that are a part of this. First of all, how they deal with prejudice. Imagine that, 1957. What is the American dream in the 1950s, and how do youthful people approach living in the society? In terms of prejudice, we find this in so many musicals, particularly musicals of Rodgers and Hammerstein, and certainly of Sondheim. And here in Bernstein's West Side Story, he deals straight on with prejudice. When Maria has met the wrong boy, he is the wrong boy because of the culture he comes from. And her sister, Maria's sister, finds that they are seeing one another, and she preaches at Maria, a boy like that who'd kill your brother, forget that boy, find another, one of your own kind, stick to your own kind. How often have we heard that since we were children growing up? I can remember growing up in the Middle West, and to date someone who was Catholic, since I was a Protestant, was simply taboo. And at one point I did date a Catholic person, and my father, my Methodist preacher father, took me aside to tell me that she was a lovely girl, but perhaps I should look inside my own religion. Stick to your own kind. Now listen to the strength of the musical language to go with Sondheim's text.
All right. Now you know.
And you still don't know. He is one of them! No, Anita. Yes!
A boy like that would kill your brother. Forget that boy and find another. One of your own kind, stick to your own kind. A boy like that will give you sorrow. You'll meet another boy tomorrow. One of your own kind, stick to your own kind. A boy who kills cannot love. A boy who kills has no heart. And he's the boy who gets your love and gets your heart. Very smart, Maria, very smart.
So we have the same, what's playing out between Maria and Tony in the attempt to get across this huge cultural divide. We find this being played out throughout the musical, and the understanding of what the American dream was. Think about the 1950s. Think about the time about there was prosperity forever. We were going to all have plenty of money. We were going to stay healthy. We're going to live to 100. And that's what America stood for. And we see played out in one song the two groups of people, the people who love the island of Puerto Rico and the people who love the island of Manhattan, and how they make fun of one another, put one another down. It's playing out that same scenario of do not trust the other.
Puerto Rico, you lovely island, island of tropical breeze. Always the pineapples grow, always the coffee blossoms growing. Puerto Rico, I see you ugly island, island of tropic, this is always the hurricane, always the population and the money and the babies crying and the bullets flying. I like the island Manhattan. I know you know. Knock on your I like to be in America. Okay, I be in America. I like to train in America. For a small fee in America. I like the city of San Juan. I know a boat you can get on. Hundreds of flowers in full bloom. Hundreds of people in each room. Automobile in America. Premium thrill in America. Quiet for win in America. Very big deal in America.
The American dream. You see that same idea played out, for example, in Miss Saigon. But here in 1957, we were already encountering them and us in the form of the two people, in the form of the two groups in the culture. And certainly, what is America about? Asking the question, is it the dream for everyone? And of course, there comes into play in Romeo and Juliet the youthful idealism. There's still a part of me that if I go to see Romeo and Juliet, I don't expect them to die. And because the youthful idealism is going to rule, is going to reign, is going to take over, and everything is going to be okay. But this gorgeous melody, which many people think Bernstein went back into a Beethoven piano concerto and took that wonderful da-dee, that wonderful interval that holds this somewhere place together. Youthful idealism.
For us, a time and place for us. Hold my hand and we're halfway there. Hold my hand and I'll take you there. Somehow
There is a place somewhere where things will be beautiful, where things will work out. A kind of idealism particularly in 1957, that youth were being instilled with, and yet it was not obviously to be. And as we come now to the end of today, I want us to take a few minutes to just think about the ending of the show. Rather than Shakespeare's ending, we have a new ending where only Tony gets killed in that relationship, and Maria is left to live in the world. So Tony dies, Maria lives. And in a way, some could argue it's even a greater tragedy than what we had with Shakespeare, because now Maria must live her life not only without her great love, Tony, but also without her big brother. And she knows that it is racial hatred that has killed them both. Another way to look at it is that it also is filled with a certain kind of hope as we come to the end of it, that some sort of peace may exist after all of these young people witnessing these needless and needless tragedies and unnecessary deaths. So there's no video now, and I want you to sit back and just listen to the very ending of the piece, because rather than ending with a lot of showgirls and a lot of showboys out dancing with lots of bling and glitz and glitter, we have an amazingly quiet ending that leaves us trying to interpret what really was happening. So as we start, we're going to hear Maria saying goodbye to Tony. And they both say, they say together somewhere, and then she says somewhere, and he has died and cannot complete it. And then they turn to the orchestra, but even the orchestra cannot complete that somewhere idea. And then there ensues a kind of march with two themes intertwined inside it. One is the I have a love, which Maria sings, and we also have the song that they sing together somewhere, brought together towards the end. And as we finish the piece, we end as quietly as possible. And to me, everything is left up in the air. Everything is left unresolved. The ending of West Side Story.
Hold my hand and we're halfway there. Hold my hand and I'll take you there. Somehow.
And then he goes. And then the orchestra attempts to complete it. Watch what happens. It's like all the life fades out. And now the march begins. 2. Almost like a funeral procession. And this begins to grow. There's a place for us. And again, the theme somewhere. And notice the bass line doesn't belong with this chord. Here it is. And here it is. Here's what Leonard Bernstein wrote morning after the premiere. He says, "The opening last night was just as we dreamed it. All the agony and postponements and rewriting turn out to have been worth it. I am now convinced that all we dreamed all these years is possible, because there stands that tragic story with a theme as profound as love versus hate, with all the theatrical risks of death and racial issues and young performers and serious music. I laughed and cried as though I'd never seen or heard it before. Not even a whisper about a happy ending was heard, a rare thing on Broadway. I am proud and honored to be a part of it." August 20th, 1957. Thank you all so much for being here today, sharing with me this time together. Dawa will be sending off to me the what's in the chat box. I see there are a number of things there. I will work diligently on them, and I look forward to seeing you next week when we deal with him as a composer, this time not for stage works, but for concert works. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful week.